Good old Nickelodeon is not the subject of today's video. Sorry. Instead, for the third and final part of our Nicktoons vs. the Network mini-series, we're going to turn our attention to Nickelodeon's sister, and in some cases superior network, Nicktoons Network. I've talked about this channel previously on a very old, very bad video on this channel, and unfortunately, we're not going to be talking about the positives. We're going to be talking about Versus the Network number 401, what happens when the network is just not a good place for original shows. For those who don't know, Nicktoons Network, or Nicktoons as it was called back in the early days and even today, is a channel that serves two purposes. The first being a place for Nicktoons to run after they've finished their production, and the second being where current Nicktoons go to die.
Did you know that this show was originally called My Life as a Teenage Cantaloupe? Seriously.
You can't tell me what to do!
But from 2005 to 2009, they had a third purpose, and that was to be a host for all kinds of original content for the Nickelodeon brand. Yeah, the asterisk meaning that a lot of these were imports from, say, Canada or the United Kingdom.
Nicktoons Network brings you the most exciting thing to come out of England since English.
But hey, either way, they were original shows that you couldn't find on Nickelodeon. This was likely done to drum up interest for Nicktoons Network since its viewership was far lower than Nickelodeon's, but as we're going to find out, this wasn't a good idea. All of these truly original shows didn't get a fair shot. Let's see if you notice the common theme throughout all these stories. The first one we're going to cover is Edgar and Ellen.
They haven't dropped a single bag of goodies yet. Patience, the fright is young.
Based on the book series by Charles Ogden, the series revolved around two monstrous twins, Edgar and Ellen, tormenting their neighborhood with all kinds of fiendish supervillain Addams Family-esque pranks. When Edgar and Ellen was getting ready to debut on Nicktoons Network, Nicktoons went all out. There were promotional toys for Del Taco's kids' meals. Unfortunately though, no toys or even pictures seemed to survive, as well as an entire Target exclusive Halloween line based on the show. They had pencils, stickers, and even trick-or-treat bags based off the character Pet. And to top it all off, they got a DVD scavenger hunt game. From what I can gather, the quality seems to be okay, but still, it was something. Nicktoons Network was trying as hard as they could to put Edgar and Ellen into the minds of the viewers, and this was because they had some big plans for the show. It was going to start off on Nicktoons Network, but then was going to transition to Nickelodeon, thereby becoming an official Nicktoon.
Are you sure? I'm the maddest of the mad. Of course I'm not sure.
Sure enough, Nicktoons Network ported the show over to Nickelodeon twice. Yeah, 2 episodes, then they just gave up. I can't imagine this would be because of ratings, because you wouldn't know the viewership trends after just 2 episodes, so the only other option would be that they just lost interest. After the failed kind of Nickelodeon launch, Edgar and Ellen just kind of died. The costs weren't meeting up with the revenue that it was generating, so I guess it had to go. In later years, the Edgar and Ellen franchise would fall into some serious copyright disputes, causing the sub-series Odyssey to be ending on a cliffhanger with no end in sight.
You know, this whole experience has left a bad taste in my mouth.
I wonder how this would have affected the Edgar and Ellen show had it still been around when these issues arose, but I guess it's all just conjecture at this point, so on to the next show. 3 Delivery, created by Larry Schwartz. Get used to hearing that name, he's been around Nicktoons Network a lot. During the time of its production, the animation studio behind it, known as Fat Cat, was going through some serious financial troubles. They weren't strong enough to carry on with a full series, but nevertheless, they sold 3 Delivery to Nicktoons Network, and it was all downhill from there. The 3 employees, yes, that's 3 as in this, who were remaining at Fat Cat tried their hardest to make 3 Delivery a good show, and at least in my opinion, they succeeded, but it was clear that Nicktoons Network wasn't able to provide them the support that they needed, because even though they had some strong ratings, Fat Cat ended up going out of business. The people remaining at Fat Cat called it a studio killer and the most demanding and torturous production they had ever seen. Now, while this alone would be good reason to cancel a series, after all, that is how Jimmy Neutron met its untimely end, Nicktoons Network doesn't always operate that way. As we're going to find out a little bit later, studio closures or financial troubles or hey, even legal issues aren't enough to cancel a series. And again, for Nicktoons Network, 3 Delivery opened up quite strongly. But apparently, it just wasn't strong enough for what Nicktoons Network needed, so 3 Delivery was cancelled without the production being brought to any other studio, and thus leaving the overarching story unfinished. Great. Oh, and before you ask, no, the YTV ratings wouldn't have been enough to save the show. The American audience has significantly more viewers than the Canadian one, so yeah, it was kind of Nicktoons Network or nothing. But hey, you can't talk about Nicktoons Network originals with disastrous returns without talking about Wolverine and the X-Men. If you were a Nicktoons Network viewer who was watching the channel at the time this came out, you could not avoid it. The ads were constantly running. It was like every commercial break, bam, Wolverine and the X-Men, bam, Wolverine and the X-Men. Nicktoons Network knew they had a surefire hit on their hands, and sure enough, they did. The pilot episode, Hindsight Part 1, opened to over 400,000 viewers. Even better was the follow-up, Hindsight Part 2, debuting to almost 600,000 viewers, meaning that, as expected, Wolverine and the X-Men was the most successful Nicktoons premiere of all time. Yet, Wolverine and the X-Men only lasted one single season. Part of this was because of Disney buying Marvel and not wanting their competitors to have any Marvel-related shows, but even before that happened, Wolverine and the X-Men was in big trouble. They were hemorrhaging money despite their consistently good ratings on Nicktoons Network. A second season was planned, but ultimately didn't happen. The studio was losing too much money to continue, and hey, even if they did, Disney wouldn't let them, so I guess Nicktoons Network was kind of stuck. They couldn't do what they did with Speed Racer The Next Generation and just outsource it to somebody else, but I'm getting a little ahead of myself here. Actually, you know what, while I'm on the subject, Speed Racer The Next Generation, created by Larry Schwartz. Hey, it's him again. Schwartz, who was a big fan of Speed Racer, was all ready to make the next big installment in this beloved franchise. When Speed Racer The Next Generation premiered, it didn't quite have as big of a premiere as Wolverine and the X-Men, but it was still a big hit. At least in terms of viewership, because it seems like critical response and audience perception was mostly mixed, but still Nickelodeon, and by extension Nicktoons Network, doesn't really care about that. They only care about the numbers. And Speed Racer The Next Generation was bringing them in. But unfortunately, around the time that Season 2 was beginning production, Speed Racer Enterprises' contract ran out. Even so, they carried on with the production of Season 2 anyways. When Tatsunoko found out, things got ugly. Speed Racer Enterprises was dragged into an extensive and expensive lawsuit. Nicktoons Network decided to do nothing to help. They knew that the contract was running out and decided to greenlight the second season anyways, and then as soon as the lawsuit started, they ripped the production from the original team and decided to outsource it to a much cheaper team, and ended up creating the widely disliked second season, which also ended up becoming the show's last. Gone were the interesting story arcs and character dynamics, and now it was just this.
What's the matter? Couldn't afford the dorms?
So going back to what happened with 3 Delivery, Nicktoons Network could have absolutely taken that show, given it to somebody else, and let the story continue. They just didn't. We'll talk about why towards the end here, but now we've got to talk about Nicktoons Network's golden boy, Kappa Mikey. Even if you didn't end up watching Kappa Mikey when it was first airing on Nicktoons Network, you at least knew a lot about its existence. Similarly to how Wolverine and the X-Men was advertised constantly when it was first coming out, Kappa Mikey was advertised in this exact same way all throughout its run. You just couldn't avoid it. Kappa Mikey was yet another Nicktoons Network original created by Larry Schwartz, but it wasn't always meant to be that way. Kappa Mikey was originally designed for both MTV and Nickelodeon's other sister network, The N, now known as Teen Nick. The series was a bit more mature when it was first being conceived, given that it was intended for an older teenage audience. Unfortunately, MTV wasn't interested, and The N, despite picking up the pilot, decided that it would rather focus on live-action dramas than original cartoons. Not wanting Kappa Mikey to go to waste, it was dumped onto Nicktoons Network after 2 years of retooling. So it was 2 years of production with The N, and then 2 years of production with Nicktoons Network, resulting in a dragged-out 4-year-long production cycle full of unmet expectations and broken promises. Nicktoons Network must have felt bad about how they treated Schwartz and company, because they decided to make Kappa Mikey its SpongeBob. You know, when it wasn't airing SpongeBob itself.
To the one and only SpongeBob SquarePants. Only on Nicktoons Network.
Despite the series not making enough money to sustain itself, as some unverified claims report that it relied on investors for the second season, Kappa Mikey not only lived a reasonably long and healthy life, but much like Edgar and Ellen, Kappa Mikey got to be shown on Nickelodeon a couple times, and just like Edgar and Ellen, there might have been some plans to have Kappa Mikey make the official move.
The all-new Kappa Mikey Christmas special only on Nick.
Though considering how much Nicktoons Network loved the show, I can imagine saying goodbye to it would be, let's just say, difficult.
One thing's for sure, there's no place like home.
Really, Mikey?
Really?
When Kappa Mikey did make its way to Nickelodeon, it only aired in inopportune time slots with no promotion at all, meaning that unless you just so happen to be watching Nickelodeon at some strange hour of the day, you wouldn't know that Kappa Mikey ever aired here. So, again, just like Edgar and Ellen, Kappa Mikey got its chance to move on to the big leagues, only for the big leagues to not really care about them all that much, and just send them back as if nothing ever happened. Oh well, at least they ended up getting the Dancing Sushi spinoff. That's something.
Don't try to make friends with her. Making Fiends is coming up next, only on Nicktoons Network.
And now we come to the most famous Nicktoons Network original story, but not for any positive reason, of course. It's the tale of Making Fiends, one that we've also covered on an equally terrible older video, one of the most mistreated and abused shows in animation history. Since this story's pretty famous, I'll make it quick. Making Fiends was a webtoon created by Amy Winfrey. The show was popular enough to get the attention of some Nickelodeon executives who promised to pick the show up as an original Nicktoon. Of course, Amy Winfrey decided to take them up on their offer, using Nickelodeon's money to expand the series into what it couldn't be online. When the first season was finished, Nickelodeon decided not to air it on their channel, but just throw it onto Nicktoons Network instead. The show did okay on Nicktoons Network, but not well enough for it to carry on to a second season, so Nicktoons Network decided to cancel Making Fiends, keeping the rights to the series to themselves.
It's my IP to sit on and do nothing with.
It seems like later on, Amy Winfrey was able to get the rights back, but still, for the longest time, if she wanted to make some sort of follow-up or revival, she couldn't. She was stuck. All because of Nickelodeon deciding to screw her out of her intellectual property, and Nicktoons Network deciding not to be supportive or make it up to her in any way. If they did it for Kappa Mikey, why couldn't they do it for Making Fiends? Well, the reason is because they couldn't afford it. Nicktoons Network's viewership is considerably lower than that of Nickelodeon's. Let's take, for example, the year of 2008. Every day, Nickelodeon would get an average of 2.2 million viewers. Multiplying this by 7, not factoring in the fact that Saturdays and Sundays will get more TV viewership than the weekdays, we can assume that Nickelodeon got about 15.4 million viewers per week. Around this time, Nickelodeon and its various other appendages, being Nick at Night, The N, Nicktoons Network, and Noggin, got a combined total of 25.4 million viewers per week. So those remaining 4 entities would have to fight for that remaining 10 million. That is not enough to keep a show afloat. That's why I'm pretty quick to believe those rumors about Kappa Mikey's second season being mostly investor funded, because as it stands, Nicktoons Network being a side cable or satellite bonus package only channel, one that also didn't rely on mainstream advertisers until later in the decade, was just the wrong place to house original cartoons. No matter how successful a show got, Nicktoons Network was never going to be able to keep them alive. That's why the longest lasting show on their channel only lasted 2 seasons. Unless, of course, you count the other original programming, being, of course, the acquired shows. These being Kaput and Zusky, Cornel and Bernie, The Secret Show, Ricky Sprocket, Fantastic Four, World's Greatest Heroes, Iron Man Armored Adventures, and Skyland. These shows were produced either in other countries with no involvement with Nicktoons Network aside from them buying the rights to air them on their channel as sort of filler, if you will, or being American foreign co-productions that had some involvement from Nicktoons Network, but were not primarily an American-based show. In the former case, the ratings on Nicktoons Network wouldn't matter whatsoever. It would mostly rely on its country of origin to keep the show afloat. As for the latter, if it failed over in America, it could probably do just as well in the other country that made it and shift fully to there. 3 Deliveries sort of fits in the latter category, but from what I can gather, it was mostly a Nicktoons Network show, so that's why I didn't include it in this list. That's really what Nicktoons Network should have done. If they wanted original shows, they should have teamed up with other studios to help bring these ideas to life. Or, if they really cared, they should have stuck to their guns with airing Edgar and Ellen and Kappa Mikey on Nickelodeon. Because, yes, they might have gotten their start on Nicktoons Network, but they could have found their way to Nickelodeon and could have lasted a lot longer. Edgar and Ellen being a possible exception, of course, considering the legal ugliness. But in short, have you ever wondered why Boomerang never decides to air original programming? It's because they can't, and they know they shouldn't. Nicktoons Network decided to take a risk to fill out its 24-hour schedule, and whether you like these shows or not, from a business perspective, it didn't pay off. These shows were not able to turn a profit. And then on the creative end, even if they were proud of what they've done, the creators in one way or another were screwed over by the very nature of being on Nicktoons Network. So what can you, the aspiring creator, learn from this mess? Of course, it goes without saying, be careful which show you pitch your network to. And I was going to say that if they do put you on a second channel like this, you gotta make sure that it's one that's viewed a lot. But given that this is the age of streaming and all channels, regardless if they're main or side, are just kind of going the way of the dodo anyways, I don't think you have much to worry about. All I can really say is don't pitch your show to something like Quibi, I guess, if that ever makes a comeback. But yes, that, my friends, is the tale of the Nicktoons Network Originals. An interesting concept, sure, but a business model that just wasn't meant to be.
Maybe I should start thinking about working from home.
Well, folks, thanks for watching the video. What'd you guys think? What's your favorite Nicktoons Network original, and what do you think is the show that got screwed over the most? My favorite Nicktoons Network original is The Secret Show, but if we're talking about stuff made just for Nicktoons, I would probably say Kappa Mikey. Okay, the show's not perfect, and it's kind of got a lot of issues, but I can't help it. I think it's a lot of fun. Making Fiends would be a close second, and I don't really know from there. Anyways, comment below and let me know because I'm always excited to hear what you guys have to say. And now it's time to thank our wonderful Patreon people, starting with our Masters of Fate. Brian Desero, Chan 11, Drew the Stew, Kev Messick, Platinum Bass, Sakamoto, Quiet Chap, Ryan Williams, Timey, Toko Blahuvian, and Woody Woo. And now for our executive producers, Albert Robinson, Blackjack, H.R. Hoffman, Indiscreet One, Kurt Bruening, Bang, Leaf Storm, Ravioli Supremo, Unkale, Vanilla the Rabbit 98, and who else but Zane? If you two would like your name read at the end of every Media Mementos video, then why not consider donating to the Patreon? There's a link in the description below for you to check out. Also, there's a link to the Media Mementos Twitter and Discord server, so stop on by and say hello. Alright folks, thanks for watching the video and I'll see you guys next time. There were promotional toys for Taco Del Mar's kids meals. Oh, whoops, there I go. There were promotional toys for Ricky Martin's Taco Fiesta's kids meals. Okay, in all seriousness, here we go.